Me? You can talk.
Thank you very much. I think some of us have the advantage in the sense that we are not directly participated in the street, but we have been observing this phenomenon from a distance and listening to colleagues and friends here from a different perspective. One certainly gets some kind of a new material to articulate the issues and concerns which are being talked about. I will make a major intervention after some time or maybe tomorrow, but a few points which I thought I will raise it here. First, it's very obvious, which has come very clearly here, that the way the entire uprising took place, it's not controlled by a very particular group. So it's very obvious that if it is not, if the participants or the stakeholders from the diverse segment of society, it's very obvious that the kind of a organizing principle which you have to devise, that's the first point which I want to make here. That what kind of organizing principles we are going to talk about. It's not necessary to use the word ideology or not ideology, because we were told that the end of history has come, but we know for sure that somewhere ideology always plays a role. But suppose there is sensitivity to the word ideology at the moment. The main thing is that how are we going to reorganize these societies in terms of politics, in terms of economics, and in terms of social structure. Now, when we are trying to do this, we have a responsibility. While one fully shares the concern that the street is much ahead, but the people who are in think tanks or academia or policymakers will have to articulate these tendencies into some kind of framework. And I think that's our responsibility, that a project like this or study like this should try to understand and articulate and work out some kind of a schema around which you can make a case that this is what a tentative, obviously it's a tentative trajectory, you can talk about it. In evaluating the certain tendencies which are defining and redefining the entire processes here, we cannot ignore the fact that time and space plays a very important role. Today we are not talking of the 1917 revolution. Today we are not talking of 48-49 revolutions. We are talking societies which we are exposed to the entire global processes. The entire cyber connectivity is a consequence of the entire global interconnectivity. So you cannot ignore the fact that it is going to play a very important role, that what is going to happen in Egypt will have its bearing or will have a bearing on it by the various kind of networking which are prevailing there. This is one important point which you have to. Second point is that which I want to draw. I felt that in any society which is moving from the stage 1 to stage 2, there are going to be certain phases which are inevitable phases, and in this phase of democratic transitions, there are certain comfort zones and there are certain traumatic experiences. It is true that the only organized group which is able to articulate and could take advantage of the electoral processes, which is only part of the democratization, because election is only part of the democratization process, not the end itself. The only group which has been able to take advantage of it is the organized groups. Now the advantage of is that this organized group, which is Islamist as it is being talked about, labeled here, it doesn't have a roadmap to resolve the kind of issues around which the entire popular uprising is taking place. If I can draw the experience from Iranian case study, you see the Iranian economy, granting that it is working under different kind of a sanction regime, etc., but in terms of reorganizing the principle of society, it remains full of all problems, all the contradictions which it has been facing before the revolution took place. So I mean, on one hand, there is a problem that Islamist groups are going to dominate the entire project here at the moment. But the fact, in fact, ironically, it is where the paradoxically is the fact that they don't have a roadmap is going to sharpen the contradictions. And if they don't address those issues, they are going to sharpening the contradictions. If they are going to be the partners of the neoliberal economic, because it's the same neoliberal economic policy which created a condition for the overthrow of the various powerful authoritarian regimes in Arab world, The same, if they are going to negotiate with that kind of neoliberal economic policies, it's not going to salvage them, it's not going to give them any kind of ease of life. So therefore, I would like to put forward a proposition here, that it is a transition phase where Islamist groups are getting inevitable advantage of being in the organized group. If they are not able to work out an agenda, which led to the kind of led to the crisis, I am sure that they will be thrown out of the system by the street, or they will become irrelevant as such. I am making this point primarily because I am concerned very seriously, especially after listening to our friends here, that the securitization of the region should not overtake the entire democratic process. Because the moment securitization becomes the prime concern of the people, then you will find that the entire military rules or the authoritarian regimes gets the legitimacy. If the people on the street start thinking that my going out of the house is not safe, the transaction cannot take place, your capital is going to come out of this country, the capital flight is going to take place, your economy is going to collapse. So ultimately there will be a kind of a fatigue into the system, and which will lead to certain kind of a revival of the old paradigm that it is precisely because of security region that the state has to be defined this way. I think this big huge opening which we have got here today in this region is, the opening is that the security which has been contested, the fact that the people feel they don't care, is something very huge asset on which possibly we should build on. This is what I would like we should consider. Second thing, coming from a country where again when we started our democratization project, we were not literate enough. We were not within quote, we were called not civilized people to carry the burden of democracy. I can say that in 60 plus years we have been able to create a kind of a system where democracy is moving. There are so many imperfect points are there in India, but the democracy is in move. One of the lesson which is one of the facts which could be worth considering here, this project has been able to move there because primarily the initial political formation was a political formation from right to left. So there is a coalition, you see. Unless until the coalition building process is not going to take place, any party, any political formation from any kind of sectarian approach is not going to provide the kind of platform we are looking for to solve the economic, political and social issues. So therefore, what I would like, when we are trying to proceed in our study or going to work out a kind of a roadmap, we have to recognize this point that the first consideration for building the project in these regions will be on democracy will be that there has to be some kind of a coalition building process should take place. All the stakeholders which are there, they should feel. Now, it's a question of social justice very relevant, nobody will deny it, you see. But the most important fact which has been bothering people here is that a sense of denial and deprivation, you see. It could be denial and deprivation in terms of economy, in terms of polity, in terms of social justice, and that is where the role of institution becomes very important. In fact, again, drawing from my experience from some of the developing countries, I can argue here that it is basically the disconnect between the institution and the people, which leads to various kind of a concern which emerge into the form of the social justice. If your institution is responsive enough to the problem of the people, then many of the issues cannot become a part of the political agenda. So, second issue which is going to play a very important role, that when you are trying to work out a new economic policies for the region, what kind of an institution we are talking of. And finally, I would like to mention that democracy is not a static concept. It varies, it evolves. And therefore, to argue that the one particular format of democracy is going to be, as the popular is saying, is that one size doesn't fit. So therefore, we will have to recognize the fact that every country has its own history, its own cultural ethos, and therefore the democratic processes will be very much governed by those processes, where this inevitable phase will come where you will have one step forward, two step backward kind of situation will come. But for us, that should not be a disappointing, way to come to a conclusion that the democracy is under threat. So these are some of the random thoughts which I thought I'll share with you, and come back to you when tomorrow with a much more articulated position which I have. Thank you very much.
شكرا للمداخلة الثرية جدا، لكن نظرا لضيق الوقت سأعطي الكلمة تباعا والرجاء الالتزام بدقيقتين لكل متداخل. فقط أعود لنقطة مهمة جدا ذكرها الدكتور، أنه أننا نحتاج إلى المأسسة. كيف نستطيع أن نصوغ حلول عبر المأسسة؟ الأخ من ليبيا تفضل.
أنا حبيت بس نعطي شوية أمل بأن المرحلة ليست سيئة اللي نمر بها نحن، وبأن الارتباك الحاصل اللي تمر به جميع الدول ما يسمى بالربيع العربي هو ارتباك متوقع. لو أن توقعنا بأن نستطيع إزالة ركام عشرات السنين من الاستبداد خلال سنة واحدة، فأعتقد أننا ما كنا نقوم بأي ثورات ولا نخرج على هذه الصورة، لأن لو أن الأمر ما هوش ضخم وتبعات الاستبداد اللي كانت سائد تحتاج إلى فترة طويلة حتى نخرج منها. تصور بأننا نحن مستعدين نكون قادرين على الخروج خلال هذه الفترة البسيطة في سنتين بعد الثورات الآن، في المرحلة التي يتم فيها التفاوض والصراع على السلطة بين التكتلات الاجتماعية القائمة. أعتقد فيه تجني على فكرة الخروج في هذه الثورات وإمكانية التأسيس إلى حكومات قادرة على تصيغ مفاهيم جديدة للعدالة الاجتماعية أو لأي مفهوم آخر. نحن عندنا تحديات كبيرة بسبب الإرث اللي ورثناه من عشرات السنين من الاستبداد. نحن قاعدين في مرحلة صياغة مفهوم لعلاقة جديدة بين المواطن والدولة، والصراع قائم. واعتقد ان التحديات التي نمر بها سواء اقتصاديه او غيرها قد لا يكون سبب نتاعها فقط ارتباك في كيفيه اداره المرحله الانتقاليه عندنا، ولكن قد يكون جزء منها يخدم مصالح خارجيه ترى في ضروره اضطراب الوضع الاقتصادي او غيره امكانيه لفرض حلول وشروط تفاوضيه افضل مع السلطه القائمه. فهذا اللي يضطر نوعا ما سواء مصر او تونس الى ان تلجا الى البنك الدولي او غيرها من الجهات الدوليه ولتفرض عليها شروط بعيده. عندنا انظمه ما زالت في اطار التفاوض لم تحسم الامور نتاعها، والتركه التي ورثناها تركه كبيره جدا جدا، وبالتالي يجب ان نكون قاسيين في الحكم على المرحله. شكرا.
مشكور اخ عبد الحكيم. دكتور توم.
I wanted to, Mustafa, directly address your question, which I think is at the heart of the conference, or at least why you brought us together, which is this puzzle over how can a democratic opening in a complicated situation lead to a society that has more social justice. It's a fundamental human question, and I think it's puzzled you your whole life professionally. And here you are in a place in Egypt where suddenly possibilities open, and now the question is real. Since I only have 2 or 3 minutes, we can talk about it more, but one way to approach the question is to try to find some relevant cases that seem applicable to Egypt and say, what are their core characteristics? And I would choose 4 cases and highlight several characteristics they have. That is Brazil, Turkey, Chile, and Indonesia. All of those are societies which were a lot poorer 30 years ago and are doing relatively well today, and interestingly are doing relatively well with a fair amount of social justice relative to their economic growth. How did that happen? All 4 of them followed actually a rather similar pattern, which is interesting. It has these characteristics. First, there was a crisis in which the fiscal situation fell apart because they simply ran out of money, and they reached a genuine crisis, a hitting bottom, as we say, in Chile in the early 1980s, in Brazil in the early 1990s, Turkey, various points. And out of that came a basic decision to try to get the fundamentals right. As you say, balancing a budget at least to some extent. And in each there was a figure. It was Kemal Dervish in Turkey. There was a relevant person in Brazil, Cardoso, who did this. There was someone who said, we'll get the fundamentals right. And then, interestingly, that person failed politically. because getting the fundamentals right made them politically unpopular because people didn't like the fundamentals. They're unpleasant. And so then what was interesting is a second phase occurred, which was a leader who was very clever politically and also economically, who followed the fundamentals but then injected a certain amount of social protection, attention to inequality, protection of labor, good treatment of foreign investment, certain basic principles that were intelligently followed. But they did that in a kind of nationalist and populist spirit in terms of motion without becoming nationalistic in a closed way or populistic in a simplistic economic way. So Lula was the perfect balance to Cardoso in that he managed to be somewhat populistic, but he injected social protection into the model without changing the model. And in a similar way, the Chilean Social Democrats took some of the legacy of Pinochet and humanized it and turned it into a social protection model without losing the fundamentals, but they did so in a very nationalistic way in certain ways. And so, and what's interesting in the four cases, it can come from any ideological direction. A military figure in Indonesia, the president there in the last 10 years, is sort of an Islamist party in Turkey, Workers' Party in Brazil, a Social Democratic Party in Chile. In a way, the ideology doesn't matter very much. It's the cleverness of the leader coming out of crisis, preserving the fundamentals, injecting the social protection and other elements, and being politically clever to play the nationalistic and populistic cards to fend off popular unhappiness while they're actually doing some good things. So there are some patterns that we can see that I think we should focus on and see as potentially relevant.
Thank you. شكرا جزيلا. أستاذ عبد الباري بسيوني، فقط دقيقة واحدة حضرتك في التدخل، هناك أخ لم يدخل. ممكن نزيدوا 5 دقائق بعد الساعة الواحدة.
ما أشبه الليلة بالبارحة. منذ سنوات مضت الرأسمالية المصرية ارتبطت ببعض الصناعات التجميعية وبعض الزراعات التصديرية واحتكار السلع الأساسية في مصر زي صناعات الصلب وما شابه. والآن الفاشية الدينية تسير في نفس النهج. كل ما هنالك أننا استبدلنا أسماء زي أحمد عز وغيره وغيره اللي هم الرأسماليين في العصر السابق بحسن مالك ومحمود عزت والرأسماليين الموجودين ويوسف ندى والرأسماليين الموجودين في القوى الفاشية الدينية الموجودة. القوى الفاشية الدينية اللي يعني توجد في الإنسان السمع والطاعة وتجعله مسخ تلقيني يلقى تمهيدا لدولة الخلافة، ويظل الفقراء أو المجتمع بلا تنمية، ودعامة الصد فيهم الزكاة والصدقة وبركات السماء للفقراء، وليس تنمية أو إيجاد فرص عمل ومشاريع حقيقية يتعايش منها الناس ويتعايش منها الفقراء. ده ما تهدف إليه الفاشية الدينية. وإذا ظل المجتمع المصري منتظرا ذلك فستكون هناك كارثة بالتأكيد. لقد في العصر السابق غاب النظام الموجود عن الخدمات، فكانت الرأسمالية الفاشية الدينية من أداء خدمات سواء من مستشفيات أو مدارس وما شابه ذلك، وتغلغلوا المجتمع المصري من خلال هذه الخدمات اللي قدموها. لما نيجي دلوقتي نشوف اللي في الميادين مؤكد حاليا في الفترة الحالية بعد عدم وجود عدالة اجتماعية عدد كبير جدا من الفقراء هم الذين يذهبون إلى الميادين يعني استنجادا من وقف الحال اللي موجودة فيه البلد وعدم وجود مشاريع تستوعب قوى العمالة الموجودة. أضيف بقى إلى جانب آخر للقول الذي سمعته من الدكتور جبريل إن الشارع يعني سابق والنخبة هي اللي بتفكر. لا، موجود في الشارع بعض النجوم اللي صنعتهم الفضائيات، ودول ما بيفكروش، دول مجرد انهم يظلوا نجوم ينتقلوا من قناه فضائيه لقناه فضائيه. لكن الناس الحقيقيين، الفقراء الحقيقيين اللي بتشوفهم في ميدان التحرير معسكرين ده من وقف الحال، واللي خرجوا في المقطم وغيره واصطدموا مع القوى الفاشيه الدينيه ده من وقف الحال. دول الفقراء الحقيقيين، والشعب المصري الحقيقي ابتدى يحس بالفجوه اللي اسقطتها فيه حكم الفاشيه الدينيه في الفتره الحاليه، وسيقاومها. الناس العاديين ستقاوم هذا الاسلوب من الحكم، ولن يقبلوا بوقف الحال، ولن يقبلوا ان تحكمهم راسماليه تحت ستار الدين وتعود بهم الى النيو الليبراليه تاني بتوحشها وبخلق فقراء جدد يضافوا الى طابور العاطل في الشعب المصري.
شكرا. تفضل.
الحقيقة أن النقاشات التي استمعنا إليها رائعة تفهم عن حلول واقترابات إيجابية لأبرار التطبيق. لأنه عند الحديث عن عدالة اجتماعية لا يمكن عزل هذا المصطلح عن حالة التنمية الشاملة أو عن مصطلح التنمية المستدامة. وهنا يثار تساؤل حول ما دور المال العربي، وهو تساؤل سياسي اقتصادي، ما دور المال العربي في إيجاد تنمية عادلة وإيجاد تنمية حقيقية شاملة. نتحدث في مرحلة في ما بعد إيجاد هذه الحالة عن العدالة الاجتماعية. فلا يمكن الحديث عن العدالة الاجتماعية استباقا قبل وجود أصلا تنمية شاملة أو تنمية اقتصادية جيدة. شكرا.
I think we all agree, and it was mentioned before, that the demands of the protesters on the street cannot really be boiled down to a small list. And it seems to me that they consisted of a mixing of economic and political demands. In the countries where there has been regime change since 2011, and that is mainly Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, the Islamists, I think, have succeeded politically because they have won elections, not in the case of Libya, but Egypt and Tunisia, on the basis of social justice. But it's a social justice interpreted in a particular manner. I think their electoral success is on the basis of the belief that as good Muslims, they will be doing the morally good thing. And that means that they will reduce corruption, they will run things more justly and more efficiently. Now, my colleague mentioned Iran. We all know, of course, we've seen in the history of Iran what this means when there are no institutions in place to ensure that there is no corruption. But nevertheless, this is early days, I think, in the case of Egypt and Tunisia as yet. What the Islamists, and here I mean the Muslim Brotherhood and the Nahda movement, I don't know very much about the Libyans. What they mean by social justice is not, I think, redistribution. It's not a fundamental restructuring of the economic system. It is, in my interpretation, capitalism, but with a charitable component to it to offset the worst excesses of the system. And this is not the same as having or putting in place a sense and ethos of economic and social rights. It is about provision, it is about welfare. It is very much represented in the social activism that they have conducted for decades now, and on which they have become very successful. Now it seems to me that, and this is my final point, that if we talk if we see the developments currently in terms of rich versus poor, and if we see what is happening as perhaps an opportunity for the poor to make a stake in a new situation, we will be missing the point. I think Turkey is instructive in this instance. What we have seen in Turkey, and Tom mentioned Turkey of course just now, is not the fundamental restructuring of the system in the sense of a change of the divisions, but a change of elites, a circulation of elites, a sort of a shift, not just at the top, but in the middle levels as well. And this is what has happened in Turkey. Basically, and that is since the 1980s, when Turgut Özal began to put in place the fundamentals of an export-led economy, what we see is a middle class in Turkey challenging first the economic positions of dominance and then the political positions of dominance, and achieving economic and social, not complete dominance, but a stake in the pie. And because the pain was taken early on from the 80s, but then of course after 2001, in the sharp year after the crisis until 2002, because of that, the pie in Turkey that I talked about before has been growing. So that circulation or changeover of elites has been happening in a situation where the pie is not shrinking. So the knives are not out, because there's enough to go around, and it has been managed well by the AKP since 2002. So I just want to point to Turkey because I think it is an instructive model. This is an Islamist movement that is completely pro-capitalist. It is neoliberal. It has done a good job. It is not overly corrupt. It has managed the economy well. This is instructive for what Islamism means. But what is also instructive is that there has been no social justice in the sense of a revolution in social structures. It's been more a shifting of the existing elites, new faces in the same structures, if I can put it like that.
I just want to...
شكرا. هناك الأخ أحمد وصل متأخرا طلب الكلمة، وهناك طلبين للكلمة. هل نستطيع التمديد؟
أعتقد يمكن أن نواصل. I think we can continue. I think we can continue the debate in the coming session. يمكن أن نواصل النقاش في الجلسة التالية، وخصوصا أنكم أهملتم موضوع هذه الجلسة. موضوع هذه الجلسة كان استعراض تجارب الربيع العربي، وننتقل بعد ذلك إلى العدالة الاجتماعية، ولكن حافظتم مباشرة إلى العدالة الاجتماعية، وبالتالي سوف نواصل في الجلسة القادمة نفس المناقشة، ولكن أرجو أن نعود إلى يعني التحديات التي تواجه البلاد بين قوسين الربيع العربي، ونناقش أيضا مسألة مفهوم العدالة الاجتماعية لدى القوى السياسية المختلفة، يعني القوى الحاكمة. وإذا كنا نستطيع أن نتحدث عن الشباب سيكون هناك ممثلون الشباب قادمة، ولكن إذا كنا نستطيع أن نتحدث عن القوى الصاعدة ما هي رؤيتها للعدالة الاجتماعية، فيمكن أن نفعل ذلك في الجلسة القادمة. I don't know whether what I said reached you because I don't have the mic, but
طيب شكرا جزيلا. أعتذر إن تعسفت على بعض الأخوة، فقط أسمح لنفسي بمداخلة بدقيقة لأني أدرت حوار. تلخيصا لكل هذا، يعني أعتقد بأنه في قفزنا للموضوع العدالة الاجتماعية قفز الجميع إلى الموضوع الحارق. في استعراض التجارب يعني هناك الكثير من subjectivism، يعني من الذاتية في الطرح، وفي الأخير عندما يحاول الإنسان أن يخرج من نفسه إلى الحل يتحدث كثيرا عن العدالة الاجتماعية. أعتقد أنه تلخيصا لكل هذا من وجهة نظري الخاصة، وقل اعبدوا رب هذا البيت الذي آمنكم الذي أطعمكم من جوع وآمنكم من خوف. وترتيب هذه الأولويات أعتقد أنه توفير الأمن، توفير العدالة الاقتصادية، توفير العدالة الاجتماعية، ثم بعد ذلك يتحدث الإنسان عن الإيديولوجيات والخلفيات وغيرها. شكرا لكم جميعا.
Coffee break and then we come back at 1:30. استراحة نعود في